Hello, good evening.
Well, it's noon for me, almost
Oh,
2
okay.
p.m.
Yes, sorry, like I forgot it. It's it's evening here.
Yeah, I hope that we won't end up too late.
Okay. Yes, maybe like I'm still halfway in my like European time zone, like mentally. I don't know. I'm still getting tired around 3 o'clock, so yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's hard to switch back to such a huge
Mm.
gap of time zones.
Yes, yeah. Somehow like somehow I still feel it.
Yeah, I told the other
Mhm.
people to come by between 5 or 10 minutes before we
Oh,
start. So
okay.
yeah,
Yes,
you're
yes,
the
cool.
first one.
Okay, I was afraid I
Yeah,
will be the last one, so
no.
okay, good. Yeah, then as I have like few questions like to you about the process of like if it is okay to ask you these kind of things now, like about the um how to say the reviewing process. Like how can I mark it best way, like in the
Yeah.
yes, how can I yeah comment best way that it is not confusing like later on, or like what do you think?
Well, we can, if you have
Mm.
time, we can talk about that after the
Mhm.
conversation. Yeah, of course.
Yes, okay, yeah, this would be good because yeah, I was wondering like what's the best way of doing it. Mm.
Yeah, I think Min still needs a few more days, she told me,
Yes, yeah,
and
that's
she
fine.
prefers to
Mhm.
review everything herself once again before
Yes,
handing
okay.
everything to you. So yeah,
Yes, of
and
course.
also with all the development part and some other things, I said that it would be nice to have September as a deadline for everyone. But
Mhm.
I guess if we can reach to end of September or early October,
Okay,
that could
okay.
be, yeah. So
Yes.
the idea is to have a really nicely done result and not rush through time. Uh,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, there's no, I'm not like, I don't have any other deadlines for this project. Like there's no campaign, like we have to for sure. Hi, Eric.
Hey.
Bonsoir.
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 Here it's still bonjour.
Mm.
Yeah, but it's already late here in I
Yes.
right in China.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. So you are like 1 hour later than Japan, or
Early.
Uh,
ahead of Japan, or
Earlier.
earlier?
I think it's going to 9 o'clock in Tokyo.
Ah, yes, yes. It's going to be
It's
9 o'clock.
going
Yeah.
8 o'clock in Beijing here.
So still early.
But I wondering I could change my background.
Mm.
Normally you should. Yeah. We are all
Yeah.
now live on YouTube too. There's
Okay.
people watching.
Okay. I didn't
I'm
know.
all
Sorry. Like,
discovering all these things. Yeah, I've never thought in my life that I would start a YouTube channel ever. But
okay.
for Words of Type, it's something that
Yes.
I accept to do. But yeah, the
But I think it's okay now. Or Lisa, you can send your background to us.
Yes,
yeah,
yeah, that
let
would, but I
me.
don't know how to do it. So I'm always keeping it just blurred.
We still
Uh-huh.
have a few minutes. Let me
Mm.
look for that. Yeah, where was that? Mm, mhm. But did you all have dinner? You're all set, ready to
Ah,
talk about
yes.
type stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think fine. Hope I'm not getting confused in languages, but yeah, I will do my best.
So Mariko, where are you now?
I'm in Kyoto, back in Kyoto.
You are back.
Yes, I'm back. Yeah. We went to Düsseldorf and Helsinki, like with
So how
25
long was it?
students.
Oh,
12 days.
12 days. Good.
12 days to escape from the heat.
Good for you. Yeah,
Yes.
this summer is very hot, especially for the
Yes.
Kyoto's.
Yeah, Kyoto is really horrible. Like it's still so hot.
I
Today it was very hot again.
heard that. Yeah.
Yes, like it's a little bit like getting steamed. Like I
Mm.
feel like constantly getting steamed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hate the humidity.
Yeah. Okay. Beijing is better? Or
Much better here
oh really? Okay.
because the climate here is very dry, you know.
Okay. So
Mm.
similar to Europe, like dry
Yeah.
heat.
Yeah.
Yes, like one of my colleagues, like she's from Colombia, and she told me that it is much better in Colombia, so it's not as hot as Japan. I always imagined it is hot, but it's not.
Colombia, you mean the Colombia in Southern America?
Yes. It seems to be much easier, like to spend the summer there than in Japan right now.
Okay, I have already received the
Yeah, I sent you the background
from
on email.
Lisa, so
Yeah.
I am
Yes.
trying setting it.
Maybe then I need some instructions, but
If you go to video on the bottom left corner, on
yes.
the video
Voilà.
icon on the
Oh, one
top, there is a
moment.
little arrow,
Let
and you
me see.
can, in the menu, you should see
Mhm.
blurry your background or adjust background and effects.
Ah,
And I think if you go to adjust background and effects, it will open you a window.
mhm.
And there's a little blue plus. And from here, you can upload any
Ah.
images from.
I lost you somewhere. Like, sorry. It was in the middle of it. Can you just say again? Like, 背景とエフェクト。
背景とか。
背景とエフェクト。でそれで、バーチャル背景。
Yeah, don't speak
And
Japanese.
you have the
Sorry.
plus
Yeah, sorry.
button. Yeah.
Yes,
You
I
have
have
the
now virtual background or video filter avatar. Sorry, and then the plus. Okay, hidden.
yeah, the plus button
Thank
on
you.
top right. Yeah.
Yes.
And choose the picture.
Yeah. And but it seems to be I didn't pull it
Hi,
down.
Nick.
Hello.
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 Mariko and Eric are setting up the words of type background.
Background.
Do you want it?
On brand.
Tânia as well. It's only if you want. Yeah, I think.
No, I think it'll take me more effort than it's probably worth.
Yeah. Hi, Tânia.
Hi,
Hello.
How are you all doing?
good.
Just so you know, I've already set up the YouTube live retransmission. So yeah, on YouTube there are
streaming already.
7 people watching.
YouTube.
Yes, it's my first time, so to say, like to experience this.
Same for me. There's maybe 10 or 15 seconds of lag between here right now and what people see on YouTube. So it's kind of weird to see myself twice moving
Okay.
at different moments.
Okay. Yeah. I think
Hi,
is
Sol.
it.
Hi, David.
Bom dia. Bom dia.
It depends on which language you're speaking with.
Kind of half covers Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. So I don't know how many people are there.
Yeah, well, we are all now live on YouTube, and I think we can start. No, it's time now.
Sharp at clock. Yeah.
Well, I will start the recording so that I can have a yeah. Okay.
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 Well, first, hello everyone. Yeah, there are more people coming in on the way, so I will just start anyway. Yeah. You are here live at the Words of Type Conversation, episode 1. And yeah, super warm welcome to all of you, and also people who will come later. First, this is the first time that I'm doing this, so if there's any issues that you are encountering, please be forgiving and let me know at an email or anything so that I could eventually improve that process. Yeah, because hopefully there's going to be more of those conversations later on. Words of Type is a project that I, Lisa Huang, had in mind for many years now, and I actually started working on it about 2 years ago. It's going to be an encyclopedia of typographic terms, translated in multiple languages and as a website. A few words about myself. I am French and Chinese. I was born and grew up in France. My parents are Chinese immigrants who wanted their kids, 4 in total, to keep their Chinese identity no matter what. And against all of their hopes, I ended up finding my interest and passion in typography. Yeah. And now I'm working in and between 2 very different worlds, the Latin script area in Europe, US, etc., and Hanzi script in China, which could also be considered as an area on its own. With Words of Type Encyclopedia as a website, it gives me the advantage to keep updating it with more words, more languages, and continuous improvements. Things are going well so far, and I'm planning to put it online by the end of this month, hopefully. We are almost there. It is very important that the access to the encyclopedia remains free, and to keep it that way, I need funding. Yeah, no, I'm not multi-billionaire yet. So there are many people involved into this project, doing great work at making everything as best as possible, and that ain't cheap. If you want to help and support us, there are many ways to do so. You can find more info on the temporary website, wordsoftype.com, and any help is very, very much appreciated. For members of Words of Type, you are watching us from Zoom, and you can ask questions to the guest today during the Q&A session later in the chat window. And for non-members, like, what are you waiting for? You are watching the live transmission on YouTube, but for future episodes, you can get a membership right now and do that, have that privilege of members. And after this, I'll use the transcript to make an article out of it, which shall be published soon. For this first episode, the first Words of Type conversation, I thought about dedicating it to a topic that is at the very roots of Words of Type, which is the vocabulary in typography. That's a big topic with many questions and things to talk about. We will hopefully get through it in the next hour and a half. And today I have invited 5 guests in the alphabetical order. There we can start with David Berlow, right here. David Berlow entered the type industry in 1978 as a letter designer for Mergenthaler, Linotype, Stempel, and Haas type foundries, many of the originals, we would say. He joined the newly formed digital type supplier Bitstream Incorporation in 1982. After Berlow left Bitstream in 1989, he founded the Font Bureau with Roger Black. Berlow is a member of the New York Type Directors Club, or TDC, and the Association Typographique Internationale, or ATYPI, and remains active in consulting and typeface design. Yes, Eric, I'm saying it the French way.
Perfect.
Next is you, Eric. You were born in China, Eric is a Chinese typographer and designer based in Tokyo now. He is the executive editor of D-Type, which is like a blog and website about all things about typography in Chinese. Super important and super useful. And co-host of Type Chat, an award-winning Mandarin typography podcast since 2015. He is also an invited expert at the W3C and co-chair of the Chinese Text Layout Task Force. Such a good name. Eric serves as a type consultant for foundries and giant companies internationally, collaborating on multi-script font projects, including Adobe's Source Hand Sans and Serif. His published works include Kongque, Restoring the Mindset of Chinese Typesetting, published in 2020, and many translations from English and Japanese, including Western Type, a book by Akira Kobayashi, I think published last year, right?
There are 3 books. Yeah, the
Oh, yeah.
first one published 10 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. And next, there's Tânia Raposo. She's a Portuguese designer, educator, researcher living in France. She's developing a PhD at Université Paris 8 in collaboration with the Atelier National de Recherche Typographique, or ANRT, and Graphic and Type Design Archives. She has taught typography for the past 10 years in the United States, Netherlands, Germany, and France. Currently, she teaches type design and typography in the communications department at ENSAD Nancy. It's also where the ANRT is. From 2020 to 2022, she developed a research project at the ANRT Postmaster program about the archive of the Swiss type and graphic designer Hans-Jörg Hunziker. I don't speak German, sorry. And has a master's degree from Type Media. Yes. Next is Nick Sherman. Nick runs Hex projects where he makes fonts and websites. Previously, Nick has worked at Font Bureau, WebType, and MyFonts, directing web design and promotional material for digital typefaces. He graduated with honors from the undergraduate graphic design program at MassArt in Boston, and he has also taught typography, typeface design, and letterpress printing. He is a designer and co-founder of Fonts in Use, and designer and developer for the Typographic Design Festival in New York. And he's a fan of monster movies and pizza. And finally, Mariko Takagi. Mariko is a German-Japanese typographer, educator, and author and designer of books. She is an intermediary between Western and Japanese culture in general, and in between Latin letters and Japanese-Chinese characters in particular. Mariko grew up in Germany and spent 6 years in Hong Kong before moving to Kyoto, Japan in 2017. The book called Emoji Graphic, published in 2022, is Takagi's most recent publication, addressing the often incorrect positioning of kanji as ideograms. In Mariko's creative work, she focuses on diversity, environmental issues, and recently gender through the lens of language, writing systems, and visual communications. And now, yeah, the presentation, I think I've covered everything. And please give everyone a warm welcome with little virtual applauses on Zoom. Yay. And I've prepared a few questions today to guide the conversation. Here is the first one. To whoever, please start answering whenever you want. There's no order, or whoever feels like it. First, if it's not English, which language did you learn typography with? That's mostly a question to Mariko, Tânia, and Eric, but yeah, Nick and David, you can also, of course, and reply. If
Maybe
you
they
have
learned it
learned
in
other
Spanish,
languages.
you know.
I'd like to thank everybody, first of all, for knowing how to speak English.
Yes.
For the sake of people who don't know a lot of different languages, but I'll let you all go on with that. I learned English and a little bit of Spanish and enough other languages to order in restaurants, and that's just about it.
So yeah, who else wants to reply?
Mariko.
Yeah, maybe yes. Yes, for me it was German. Like yeah, I graduated from a German university, so my first language of typography was German. And then like moving to Hong Kong, I needed to learn all the terms again in English. And yeah, and then I went to Reading and after that to Japan. So while I was doing already my research on Japanese typography for my doctoral thesis, I started, of course, comparing the terms. So yeah, so first was German, then English and Japanese maybe at the same time. And yeah, that's it somehow. Like I didn't, yeah, learn anything or any language new in this context of typography, but it would be amazing.
How
That's
about
it.
you?
Quite a lot.
In my case, and of course, my native is Chinese, so I learned the first experience from in Chinese, but then I moved into Japan, so and I compare all the terms with Japanese and English, especially I have translated some books, so I have to check every details of every concept is exactly the same or not between the Chinese, Japanese, and English, which sometimes I lost in translations. Yeah.
How about Tânia?
Started a very basic typography class in Portuguese, but most of it I learned in English when I was doing my master's at Type in Media, and recently moving into France and having to teach typography, I had to learn a lot of terms in French to teach to my students, which is sometimes they are teaching me what are the terms, which is really nice. I enjoy it.
Nice. Well, I'll continue with the second question then. Did your first experience with typography set any foundations in your career that never changed afterwards, or very little in terms of perspective, techniques, process, things like that?
One thing that I thought about when you sent this question to us was how, as long as I've been involved in typography and type design, and long before I was involved, basically all the way back, the idea of typography seems to revolve around rectangles. Glyphs are drawn in rectangles, and that's kind of like how it started, how it's been going. I think like there are some interesting ideas of how to break away from the rectangle, but that's one technique that I think people just kind of take for granted, is that type uses rectangles, and that's what we've all got used to. It's not really related to vocabulary so much, but it's just like something that I always think of as kind of a permanent thought in the world of typography.
Yeah, for me it was quite interesting because after my own like first degree, like I started teaching immediately in Germany at FH Münster, Fachhochschule Münster. So this was my first like teaching job, and it was, I think, 2002. Like I graduated 2001, and 2002 I got the first offer to teach. And like typography was always my passion. Like it was always like my favorite class. And also, yeah, my graduation work was also using typography and designing a book. So, so this was not, yeah, somehow researching about typography, but rather applying it. So when I started to teach, I found out that I have to learn in a completely different way, because until that time I was applying typography all the time, but I was not used to talk about it in details, and also make students aware of like the whole vocabularies and the concept of it. So I really like to be able to teach myself. I needed to study again quite intensively, and like this was my first experience in trying to find what terms I use in my class and how I classify things and all these kind of concepts. Yeah, it was a kind of a big challenge at that time.
Who wants to? Does anyone have to say anything? Eric, Tânia, David?
Yeah, my experience has changed in a lot of ways completely and totally, and in other ways not at all. So I'm always sort of drawing for a final result, designing for a final result, but the way that we get there now is so different from where I started. I mean, I started out where it was basically an assembly line. There was 6 levels of management above me, where I would end up with a bunch of pieces of paper with lines drawn on them to show where the stems and alignments were going to be. And then it was up to me to draw the curves and all that stuff. And I was coming in just as the assembly line was leaving, but after I would have finished my drawing, somebody else would have taken it and cut a rubylith frisket and done other things to it after I was done. And even after I got to Linotype, Stemple continued to work in that way after we got Icarus. So Icarus sort of was the first digital computer that any of us got our hands on. And that was definitely made for an assembly line process. And so in the office I worked in New York, what Mike Parker and Sherry Cohn and Matthew Carter were interested in doing is fostering a design studio where people were responsible for the entire font. And you just started from the very beginning with an empty box and an empty bunch of drawings, and you slowly worked it into an 86 character alphabet at the time. I mean, we were barely even covering the NATO countries and had to trade with Stemple so that they would draw some of our characters and we would draw some of their characters. It was a pretty chaotic situation. But out of that came a small group of 6 type designers who could do it all themselves on an Icarus machine. And then when we moved to Bitstream, we moved to an interactive machine, which was just a big, expensive, loud Macintosh without any of the nice things that you could do besides design letters on it. So, and from there were always words coming in. There were always new terms coming in for things that, open type features and hinting and a grayscale and bitmaps. We didn't have any of that stuff. Unicode was new to us. And so there's been this gathering of this technological bundle that is what makes it possible for all of us to be independent and users to have so many choices. And that's mostly not open source, but there are open source inlets to it where people can get access to font tools. For example, Fontra is now an open source product that does a lot of things that's new. So, and all those things have new words that come into the vocabulary, and they're mostly coming from Latin developers who are developing those technologies. So I'm very interested in sort of this diversity effort for vocabulary, partly because I think it's important for people to use the same word for the same thing. And then on the other side, I think it's important to use a different word for different things. So we have this situation. It's one of the questions that Lisa asked is, how do you tear all this stuff apart and get it to be right? And it's very difficult to do. You can do it on a small scale. So I've been in 3 studios so far, type design studios, where we had to develop common vocabulary for doing things so we could even talk about the fonts that we were working on. And each one has become a little more advanced. in how it separates things out. And at the end of my career, which is where I am now, I'm just giving like 4-letter abbreviations for things, and then hoping that we can figure out what goes on from there, because that relates directly to the technology I'm working with, which is open type variable fonts. And there is a way for more expressive words to be used, and we're working on that. With all of the things that we work on, we're trying to have this, there's what the computer understands, and there's what some people understand, and then there's what many people understand. So that's what I'm interested in. And the whole issue of all the scripts in the world being presented to me every single day is a relatively new thing in the last 10 years or so. Because even 10 years ago, there was not so much information on the internet as there is now. Recently, I went to write an article about all of the workstations I've used. And 4 years ago or 5 years ago, I tried to do that, but I couldn't find very many articles about it. But now they're all there. The people who are using all the systems I was making fonts for, and a lot of the hardware, have retired, and in their free retirement time, they're documenting what they did over their lives. So Reddit is now filled with stuff about like Aristomat drafting plotters and stuff like that, people's funny stories and lives with those products. And that's making it easy for me to document all of my workstations, so people can sort of get a feeling for how things went along. From, there are no bitmaps, there's no resolution, there's no Unicode, there's no operating systems, there's no user interfaces, there's nothing to start with, basically, except for MS-DOS and a very early Macintosh that was like, sculpting a bust of somebody through the porthole of a ship. We've got this little tiny screen, and you've got this big, huge view that you need. So everything has moved along, and the words for it and the technology for it. And I'm really, really happy to see all that progress, but I'm a little bit concerned that there's like a lot of divisiveness that's risen up over platforms and tools and scripts and politics and economics. There's got to be better ways for us to work together to help everybody out with this. And I think Lisa is like the star of the show here, as far as getting it so that we know where to start with words, because that's really what we all have together, besides the M square. All share the same M square, and we all have words for it. So it's interesting to see this start to develop, and I'm very excited to watch and to help in any way I can.
Thanks, David. Yeah. Well, I think I can continue with the next question, because it's directly connected. With a living organism like language, and in a field that goes through such an extent of time as typography, like what you said, David, with you saw so many technologies through your career. How important do you think that using an accurate vocabulary is? Like, you sort of introduced that question already, but if all of you, like everyone else, you can develop also on that?
Well, I sort of implied that in my studio, my various studios, we've come to an agreement on the words. And this is like the first circle. You can talk to yourself all you want in whatever words you want to, but it doesn't make much difference. It's when you get into a group. So the first group that I consider is the people I work with. And then there's rings going out from there to customers, so that we can talk the same language to them, because they have terms. They used to have all terms for all sorts of proprietary systems they use that you had to learn. And then they had their own terms for things that they were doing. And then you have the wider world of type designers. And each time you move further and further from yourself, you have more contradictory statements going on, till we finally get to where we're sitting right now. And there's tons and tons of them. Just inside of English, there are lots of competitive. That, you know, the word variation means various things on the web already, and so it's you know, every time I see a split like that, I jump in right away and say, no, we're already using this term for that, and I don't argue for too long about it, because I'm not really happy about having my efforts associated with the term. I'm interested in people agreeing on what the term is for something. And if people start to argue about it, I just go back to my work. But I think it's important for us as a widening group of type designers and type developers to, even if we have to say 2 words to describe something because we haven't agreed on it, you know, with spacing or tracking, people get confused about those terms, and I don't use them interchangeably anymore, but I understand that people do, and there's nothing I can do about it because it's so widespread. So I'm interested in, you know, like, if nothing else, explaining the differences so that people can say, oh, okay, I understand, but I'm still going to use my old word because my circle is different from your circle. I'm in Condé Nast, and we all use this word, and I can't change it. So this is the kind of thing that we have to deal with, and I think it's an interesting problem.
I see it as kind of, I try to be as accurate and precise as I can in my own writing or when I'm speaking. But I think it only really matters as far as people understand what you're saying. Some people get really hung up on like correcting people, even though there's no misunderstanding, which seems kind of like a waste of time to me. But I think as long as everyone kind of understands the underlying message and the terms are kind of established well enough for that to happen, that's kind of like, I think the goal, at least as far as I'm concerned. One thing I will say though is that it's been very important for me personally to try to use accurate vocabulary, because I've learned so much about type and even the history of type just by trying to pick the right word when I'm writing, you know, even if I'm just like writing a short message or something. And I'm like, well, should it be this word or this word? And it inevitably will, I feel like anything in typography, it's going to lead you down a rabbit hole of like learning, like, why is it called tracking? Like, there's a reason why tracking is called tracking, and it's interesting, and it's related to technology and the history of typography. And so for me, like, when someone says tracking, in my mind, I'm thinking of like this kind of historical idea. And I don't tend to use that term unless I'm talking to someone who I think will only understand that term. But yeah, I feel like vocabulary is a good gateway into learning just about whatever it is that you're talking about.
And I'd like to add there that we're very fortunate in our career to be choosing something that has visual representations of the things we're talking about. So we're not like psychologists or economists or people who can just, you know, throw more terms at you that you don't understand, or throw a bunch of numbers at you. We can show you a picture of tracking versus something else. And so that's one of our greatest strengths, is that not only do we have these visual things, but almost everyone in the world who knows a script can relate to those terms when you talk to them and show them their script doing these things. So I've talked to thousands of people about terminology. They don't know what ascenders or descenders are in Latin. And then you say, they say, oh yeah, I know what those are. And they know exactly what they're for. They don't, you know, they don't know what they're for, but they know that there's a difference that they represent. And so they start to understand that you're not nuts. The rest of you, but I'm not.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting also what Nick said, because I think like especially German is very pictorial in sense of the typographic terms. So I found it always kind of very descriptive, the terms used in German, for example. And in Japanese, like many terms are translated or they are just transcribed from English. So they stay English in Japanese. They are not like written in kanji or hiragana, but katakana. So they become quite anonymous. So what I see, for example, for my Japanese students, they are Japanese or they are English terms in Japanese shape, but they can't relate to that because the words do not have any meanings to them. So I think like this is quite difficult if it comes to the point that you have terms which are just transcribed to a certain like writing system, like in Japanese. But I think also like just going back a little bit in the thought of like why we need those terms and why we need vocabularies for that. So, and that's also relating a little bit to David, because everyone like who reads a book, everyone who starts typing something in a computer or on the phone or something like this is doing somehow typography, like is using typographic systems, but it is not intentionally and they are not aware of it. So the point is like a lot of people, or I think everyone like who was not educated in graphic design or typography does not have any access to those terms. And because they don't have the access to the terms, those details do not exist. But if you start giving them the terms and the vocabularies and the words, they suddenly start to see the details and start to understand what they are doing. And many times they are doing it in like somehow more unconsciously. So they know like what book is like difficult to read because maybe the line spacing is too tight, or maybe the chosen font is too dark, like for the size. So they know that it is not very easy to read, but they do not know why. And if you start like teaching them the terms and teaching them how the details are named or what function they have, they suddenly also start to see the type. And that's what I always experience in my classes. And I have also, I'm teaching also in, I'm teaching graphic design history and theory, and I'm implementing typographic ideas in my class. And this course is now given online because I have students, like almost 200 students every year, like who are subscribing this class. And I have students from the Department of, for nursing, for example, or I have students from the Department of English, of Japanese, of education of children, for example. So they come from all the different departments and they start then, for example, learning about typography and learning about writing systems. And also I make exercises with them. I let them draw some characters. And they do it and they have to name what they see and they have to compare those fonts. And suddenly they start to acknowledge the shape. And what's very, very interesting is it doesn't have to be my students who are educated in graphic design or who are doing media studies, like who will be or who will do the best result. But sometimes it is like somebody from the literature department. And it is sometimes a person who's very much into poem and reading a lot. So I think like what's quite cool about typography is it doesn't have to be a person who is very good in drawing illustrations. So if you like to read or if you have a connection to writing, you can get interested in this material and they can get very, very good. And that's quite fantastic, I think. And this is also, for me, a motivation to keep on doing what I'm doing. So yeah, and the vocabularies, they are really a kind of a bridge between like two different worlds and where we can start connecting and start talking about like one theme. So I think it's really also valuable what you are doing, Lisa, with your project.
You know, it's very interesting to see that how what you said, Mariko, that it's been reaching to more people than only type designers or graphic designers, because in fact everyone uses type, no matter what job you do or how old you are. Like as soon as you learn how to read and write, you do use type. And it's making me think of cooking. Like when you start to know what action, how it's called, and how you do it, then you start to cook better in a way. Like chefs, they have those huge cookbooks with their own vocabulary. Like you could do words of cooking, something like that. I'm sure it will be much bigger and much more complex than words of type even. There are so many subtle variations between one action and the other, and when you can put a word onto one and another word onto the other, you do the difference between the two, and you can like really like get the difference between those. And I think that's not only making the language more rich, but also more diverse, and it's only adding up to the quality and how interesting it can be. And yeah, that was the only thought that I have that I
Yes.
had.
Yeah, but I like the idea of comparing it to cooking because, like in sense of eating or in case of eating, like you can only know like what's really delicious and great if you have tasted a lot, like if you have eaten a lot and if you like eating. And I think this is also similar to typography. Like if you grow up reading a lot of books or seeing a lot of great things, you get a taste by yourself. Like you start archiving different shapes in your head, in your memory. So you get sensitized for that. And I think that is really like creating a great base, like for everything what comes after that. So you have already a good solution, like a good fundamental knowledge about things, and then you can add maybe specific knowledge on top. And I think that's also kind of a way of getting better in design or getting more sensitized for shapes and so on. So very similar with eating and cooking, I think.
Yeah, but I wanted to also add something that Nick said, that I find that almost I want to question like what is accurate vocabulary anyway, because I find that I change a lot my vocabulary depending on the people I'm talking. So I feel like it changes a lot with the context. And I really see a similarity of my approach to this, also of the approach I take when I'm learning a new language, or if I'm helping someone learning a language, which I rather that we understand each other, even if it's not 100% correct, than to be very minutious about it and that people lose a bit of hope, or I lose hope if I'm like, if I'm very rigid with it, then I would not be able to speak French now, because otherwise you have to accept you're making mistakes and that you just want to communicate. So as long as we can communicate with someone, and that just creates growth, because the more you're comfortable with it, then you can. And also with the students, I'm usually not like, that's not how you say it. Like you need to let people be comfortable and slowly introduce things to them, because otherwise we are just living in a language dictatorship, which is also not good, because language is an ever-evolving thing.
Well, it really depends because, yeah, finally, it is kind of a communication. If you talk with your client, you don't need to be so serious because you do not to change the exact words, even if it is not necessary. But sometimes, even the common people would like to learn some terms to show sometimes, oh, I know a little about the typography, something like that. But there are also some issue because the exact meanings of the professional words, the terms, changed because of the applications in the digital world. As I talked last time, for example, the term for line spacing, in Chinese and Japanese, we usually say line spacing, but what exactly it is a leading or a line gap or a line height. It really depends. And sometimes even we are professional, we're using the professional applications such as InDesign. In InDesign, we have the option for Latin, but Latin is not the exactly Latin we had in the metal type era. So it really depends what kind of work you are doing and what kind of communication you are taking about. Sometimes, yes, if you are talking with your colleague and there is a work in front of you, that's easy because, yeah, we have the picture in front of us. But sometimes, for example, I also hold a podcast program, which you only have the sound without any picture. You have to have every audience to have imagine what you are saying about. That is quite tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a really complex balance to find between accuracy of words and how organic or how blurry the frontiers can be in between. That's I think what I find most interesting with language, typography, and so much more. Like it's not like mathematics. Like I hate mathematics. There's no just one answer to one question. There are many things, and that's what makes it so interesting. Yeah,
I think another thing that people sometimes get kind of mixed up is that having accurate vocabulary doesn't necessarily mean having specialized vocabulary. So in a lot of cases, I find myself actually kind of dumbing down the terms that I use because some typographic terms are too specialized, I think. There are simpler ways to describe certain things that a person who's not a typography expert or even a graphic designer would understand. And I think sometimes designers kind of have fun using the very specialized terms. It's kind of like this inside lingo thing, but I try to use as few specialized terms as possible if I can.
depending on who you're talking to.
Well, even if I'm talking to like other typeface designers, for example, the idea of old style figures is one that it seemed like overly complicated. Like I just call them lowercase numerals because that's kind of how they function. And if I said like to my mom, oh yeah, these are old style figures, she'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But if I said they're lowercase numerals, she'd be like, I didn't know you could have lowercase numerals, but then like she knows what those two terms mean and she can put it together. And it's not any less accurate than if I had used a specialized term that she didn't understand. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff in typography that I think probably would be better just to do away with altogether.
Yeah, but I think also there are sorry, like there are also there are quite a lot of different terms like for the same for the same thing or for the same element. And I researched quite a lot about this when I wrote Hanjigraphy, where I tried to explain body parts of kanji characters or Hanji characters to a rather English reading audience. So this was somehow like one of my big assignments in that book, that I tried to search those terms and compare them, and also not only show one or only decide on one final term, but rather say like what are the options and what is used by whom and so on. So that was quite interesting because I did it not only in English, but I also searched it in German and Japanese and Chinese at that time. And so like if you have 10 books, maybe 8 of them are using different terms. This is quite challenging. And especially like if you want to first like find the perfect match or the perfect solution, and it's not there, or most of the case it's not there. So I liked very much what Nick said. But also I think in German there is this minuscule Ziffer, which means like really lowercase figures, like if you translate it to English. And so, or there's also another term like this text figures and so on, so that people can, I think, get it better. Like text figures, I think it's used in InDesign as well. So there are like also in different versions of InDesign, what I've seen so far, using like different terms, especially like for Japanese. So yeah, so some terms are changing, like from English-based katakana versions to Japanese words, which confuses me then suddenly, because sometimes I have another version of InDesign than my students. And then they are saying like, I don't have this, what you are talking about. It's not on my monitor. But yeah, I think this is quite also close to the idea what you have mentioned in your questions, like it is organic and it is changing and evoking. But Eric,
But
sorry,
I
I cut you.
never mind. But I so envy you in Japanese because you have katakana. You just transcribe it. You don't need to translate it. There's still a lot of discussions how we should translate typography, the word typography in Chinese. The basic word of typography, how to say it in Chinese. We don't have the one answer. We have several kind of expressions for that. So, and talking about the old style numerals, it is also interesting because it must an old style numerals be proportional, because for example, in design manuals, there are four. You have to talk about the width, also together matching with the old style or the lining things. So you have four options. So the localization for the Japanese style version of InDesign just change their translation, and the user just lost their way to how to use it. Something quite complicated.
Well, I guess that you all, like there is this question, maybe not question, I don't know. We all get to find for the same meaning, 3 different words, or even more maybe. Typography, typeface, font, typo or type, or even in French we would say typo, and in itself it doesn't mean anything. It's just typography in short. How would you sort these out, and would it really be important to clarify everything, to be as nitpicking as possible and say, yeah, font is not the same as typeface, or just let it live on its own and let people use it as they want to?
I
I
don't
was
think
so surprised that a font is called police in French.
Yeah. Also, police de caractère. It's like character police. I don't even know why. Tânia, do you know why it's called police de
I
caractère?
don't. I know that's a good rabbit hole to investigate. Maybe Nick will get into it.
I'm also
But
very
I think
interested.
it should be kind of, in English, we say the scheme of the font. For example, if you use a set of the font, if you have 3 letters of a small a, you have the same 6 letter of small letter e, and 7 letter of small letter o, something like that. There is a scheme, something like that. I think that something like a policy kind of things. That is why.
Yeah, there's
I think
one person in the chat, Rosalie, she says that it's police, like in police d'assurance, which is like it
policy.
refers to the license. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. I
Interesting.
learned something.
There you go. It's a
Mhm.
perfect example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, where like you're like, yeah, why is that? One thing I was always envious about in German is they have this term Schrift, which is kind of an umbrella term that covers lettering, typography, typeface
Everything.
design, calligraphy. And that's usually what, you know, typical non-designers are talking about when they say, oh, I love typography. Like if you do a search on Instagram for the hashtag typography, probably 95% of the stuff is not actually typography in the strict sense of the term. So I always liked this term shrift, and I've like tried to insert it into some of my English correspondence, and I feel like I'm forcing it. But I have like my own mental kind of hierarchy of things that are involved with typography, because there's like characters, there's glyphs, there's typefaces and fonts, there's sorts, which is a whole other thing. I have a whole, don't get me started on the idea of sorts. But I have like in my mind, there's kind of this relationship, and it's kind of like a 3-level relationship. There's the things that we look at, like the things we see, which are designs. There are the things that are kind of more abstract ideas, like a character. The letter A is like an abstract thing. And then there's like storage mechanisms and delivery mechanisms. And they're very specific terms, at least in my mind, for related things. So for example, like a glyph and a character, a lot of people just use those terms interchangeably. In my mind, I think of it more of like the glyph is what we see, the character is kind of the abstract idea. And then there's also like the kind of delivery mechanism that's in a font. But yeah, I've worked up my whole own vocabulary of how I use those words, and I don't know that I try to think about them in a way that maps to how most people will understand them, and it's also like accurate. But I think most times it probably wouldn't matter if I said glyph or character, that most people would know what I'm talking about. Just like Tânia said earlier, it depends mostly on the context. If I'm talking about like, yeah, I mean, when someone says like, I like this font, and maybe what they mean is I like this typeface, it doesn't matter. Like I understand what they're saying. It's not worth like correcting them. It's just annoying when people say that.
But are you sure, like when are you like 100% sure that you know what they're talking about?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, it's true. I'm sure there are times where, in fact, I know there have been times where I've had clients that said one thing and meant another thing, and I misinterpreted. The classic one that I think probably I see causing the most confusion is the term weights. For whatever reason,
Really?
people talk about weights as in individual like font styles. So regular and italic, they'll refer to as weights. I don't know where that came from, but it's been an issue where if I'm talking about a typeface I'm working on and the client is expecting so many number of weights and I deliver something else, there's like some disconnect. They're looking for a number of styles and I'm delivering a different, yeah, we're kind of working in a different world. So sometimes I like to, if I'm, especially if it's like the first time that I'm using some of these terms in the way that I prefer to use them, I'll kind of use them with like a secondary term, like it'll be like style, like fonts / styles, or like something that helps disambiguate what I'm talking about.
So you're creating new and more complex words in a way to make sure that they understand.
No, I try not to invent new words. And I think I've
Or like hyphenated words.
No, it's more just like, yeah, disambiguation. I think the styles, I think another time when it helps to be very accurate is if you're doing like contracts or licenses. So if I'm talking about like, you know, how many styles this typeface is going to have at the end of the project, I have to say like I try to say like how many font styles, because that kind of helps clarify that I'm talking about individual fonts, which, you know, maybe it's not like the most semantically accurate, but it helps to kind of disambiguate whatever I'm talking about. And usually when I'm writing that kind of stuff, I think like of the very worst case scenario where the client is extremely angry and they aren't getting what they expected. I can like go back and say like, this is how I wrote it, and hopefully it's clear enough when you write those kinds of things.
I can go on with the next question. Also, yeah, really closely related to this one. Have you ever experienced any lost in translation kind of impression from meetings or talks or discussion with peers or clients about topics that you're unfamiliar with?
Well, I can start out and say that in my travels, that's happened quite a bit. When you visit, when I visited Taiwan or Hong Kong in the old days, there was a translator all the time going in both directions. And I was not as familiar with the scripts that they were dealing with as I am now. And so there was a lot of back and forth about whether the words that were being said to me were right for the things that I understood them to be, because we didn't always have pictures. This was the problem, is that people didn't come armed with all the things that they thought would be necessary to have discussions like this. So, and of course, I have a whole ton of technical terms that are coming out of Google, Microsoft, Adobe, and what's the other one, Apple, that they've chosen to use that you have to get translated in and out of these other languages. So it's best just to stay home in a case like that. But there weren't any choices at the time, and so there have been some wonderful misunderstandings about what overlaps meant and what simplification meant and what regularization, terms that were happening during the early digital period that are not really used anymore, because we have a lot more resolution and we have things that have made it easier to talk about, because we don't have to talk about certain other things, like even hinting. I mean, hinting used to be something that would take quite a bit of explanation, and you could not possibly show people what it was like without a before and after image of hinting. And so fortunately, things like that have dissipated. The importance of some things dissipate and other things get more important, like, you know, the boundaries of the fonts. And many of these things have been very much damaged by the terminology that's been used by companies. So that when I would go from talking to Microsoft about alignments to Apple talking about alignments, or to Google with people put the, you know, when you add line spacing, we all think that in hot metal, you always add it below. And there are no exceptions to that rule. We just always do, because otherwise you're misplacing the top of the text relative to the box. But that's not the way that everybody works now. There's software that splits the difference, and there's software that does other stuff. And typography itself, the consistency of the system is under serious threat from inconsistency. And some of this, when Nick talks about weight, well, you know, some company in the Northwest decided to give arbitrary numbers from 1 to 9 for the weights of fonts, and then added 2 zeros to imply that there were actually a lot more values than there were, but there were only 9 of them, and they were specific to a family. And so you can't talk about a 400 weight here and a 400 weight there. Completely and totally destroyed the word. weight 400 is meaningless.
Do
And
you
so
know who decided that system, like created that system in CSS?
Wasn't it carryover from Panos?
it
Like
was the devil. It was the devil who owned the karaoke club, Phoenix, Arizona, and didn't even know what karaoke meant. And then he sent a message to Microsoft and said, "Hey, let's have numbers for weights." And widths are also expressed as a percentage of the default in OpenType. And this has been a 20-year struggle to get away from something that nobody can understand, not even type designers. And so when we're finished with this, we can bring this up, we can file a suit, class action suit. And they're not the only ones, trust me. I mean, Google has done horrible things typographically. Adobe right now is not supporting the OpenType format enough, and I see a flood of messages saying, this doesn't work in InDesign and this doesn't. And all we can say is Adobe is, they've been non-compliant with TrueType since 1989. And I don't expect them to change. And those are huge problems for us as font developers to explain things, because we've got to get out of this hole that they've already put us in to explain something as simple as weight. And forget about optical sizes unless you can really demonstrate what they look like, because otherwise people won't understand it. Because somebody published a font called Verdana. There was an 8-point master that everybody thought was fabulous until they got it over 24-point, and then it looks like the horse got loose from the barn. And so I'm sorry if that didn't make sense to a lot of people, but this is my English. And so you're stuck explaining to people, because Microsoft didn't publish any information about, they published an 8-point. And I took off after Matthew Carter about this, and he said, no, it's a 9-point. I said, well, what's the difference? So I mean, there's this thing you need to, it's very difficult to explain optical sizes after somebody has published one without a label on it. And that's even worse with display faces, because people make a lot of fonts that don't work at smaller sizes because they look good at large sizes. And so explaining this stuff and demonstrating it has been very difficult. I have gone through an entire generation of art directors and design directors and production directors at a lot of major publication firms who are now retired, and I've got a whole new generation of people that I'm trying to educate, and they're mostly web focused, which is a really good thing. But it's also a really bad thing, because the web is where most of the bad stuff that you find is. And people were doing so much padding of their text in the past to make sure that it was responsive. But the responsiveness was just like changing the boundaries, and everything else stayed the same. So getting out of that sort of method of where people were doing the ultimate safety in typography has been a real challenge too. So now you start to see people taking chances with things and doing more querying and finding out what the page actually looks like is an important thing when you're planning your typography. And the original web just ignored all that. So.
Yeah, I think there's the weight issue is related to a lot of other issues, not only vocabulary, but including vocabulary, where there's some ancient legacy thing that's been carried over, sometimes across multiple platforms and formats, and it's still kicking around just because that's how it always was, and people are kind of hesitant to change those things. And one example, it's not, I wouldn't even, I guess at this point, I would consider it legacy. But one term that always seemed kind of crazy to me is with CSS, there's this property called font stretch, which is basically supposed to be talking about the width of the typeface, like a designed width. But anyone who hears the idea of font stretch, they just think of, fake stretching, like the thing that most graphic designers try to avoid. And when it first came up in the specification, which I think was like, it was way back when, it maybe even in the 90s. And it wasn't until more recently that it started getting implemented. And when they were starting to implement it, people, including myself, were like, hey, don't use that term. It's just going to confuse people. It's like, really, you couldn't pick a worse term, probably. It's almost the opposite of what you're trying to describe. And at first, the reaction was basically like, oh, well, it's already in all these specifications, even though it hadn't been implemented widely yet. People were like, yeah, there's a lot of things in CSS that aren't perfect, so I don't know, I guess live with it. And thankfully, they've now committed to changing it so that there's like you can use font width instead, and it will make more sense. But there's so many things like that that just come through technology, and maybe it's people in the technology world that don't fully understand.
Absolutely.
And they end up just sticking around. Yeah.
Font size adjust is the Y version of the X example you just gave. I mean, font size adjust is supposed to make it so that a web programmer can keep the size of the font consistent even when it goes to the fallback by putting in a scale value, but it never mentions what you're trying to scale. I mean, there's no documentation that says, this is where you get the height difference between these fonts. And so people are just guessing what font size adjust does and what font stretch does. And those are the two major dimensions we have to deal with, and they're both screwed on the web. So, I mean, it's really an uphill battle there. And I really admire people like Nick and anyone else who tries to take these people on, because they go forward with ideas that come from I don't know where for word picking.
And especially talking about the specification and standards, especially in the digital world, there is a very complicated thing about the so-called back compatibility. Once the specification uses a wrong word, it will be considered as a legacy, and everything later should use the wrong word again and again. They cannot change because everything will be ruined if you change the specification. Even not only CSS, there are also the Unicode. Once the name of a character is decided, it cannot change. Even they find it was the mistake, but we have to use the.
It's not just that it's decided. There are millions of lines of code. It's over.
Yeah, that's why we have to. Yeah, please go for it.
I mean, once it gets into CSS and gets into code, forget about it.
One of my favorite examples of this is the Unicode name for like the French style quotation marks, guillemets, and originally Unicode, there was like a misspelling, a typo. They spelled it as guillemot, which is a bird or something, and it stayed.
It's a goose foot.
Yeah,
it's a goose.
But yeah, it stayed that way for probably decades. It was like, and that was just like, yeah, someone made a typo, and that's how it was. It's so stressful.
Yeah, but who cares? Some would say.
At least once a month, I want to go back to hot metal.
Well, yeah, we can go on to the next question. Having a clearly understood vocabulary is like we discussed here, is already a big challenge in our industry. Do you see any other one of those challenges for tomorrow, and how could they be addressed other than clear and vocabulary?
My brief opinion is that there's nothing more important. Because we can't even talk about the other things yet.
Well, I would imagine it's not really my subject to talk about or my area of expertise, but I think in terms of tools, it's really uneven. So for people developing scripts other than Latin, there is much less accessibility to tools that do the same that they do for Latin. So I guess that could be considered an uneven field in our industry.
Yeah, even tools that we're using in type design and typography, like if they don't exist in any other language than English, then a huge part of the world is not using that tool, those tools.
Even, for example, last year I had three Korean students that were studying here. Well, they are still here. And so they are working in different levels of complexity, because one is working with a Korean InDesign, but with English translation of terms. The other one is working with the Korean InDesign with Korean. And the third is working with French InDesign. And all of these InDesigns, like now I also work with French InDesign because it became very hard for me to explain because things are not the same. And it's very annoying because already like there is shortcuts that I was used to all my life that they don't work anymore in the French. But what I wanted to say is that there is even there is things that we are so used to that are available in like the English or the most widespread InDesign versions, that they are not at all available in like other InDesign. Like I just have this example of Korean that was like impossible to, I forget what we were trying to do, but it was about the adjustment of a text, and I was explaining like the justification settings and like the césure, the
line break.
And the settings didn't exist in the Korean InDesign, so we couldn't adjust this kind of thing. So it looks like you can have it, but then also things are organized in a different way, which of course I understand that for Korean it doesn't need to work the same way, but it's I just don't understand why we couldn't implement it all in one program.
Can be even really like super frustrating to be blocked by like such, it's almost like super tiny issues, but then it has such a big impact on the work and the teaching and everything.
Yeah, maybe just to add something about the difficulties of different InDesign versions. So maybe more Adobe bashing, but before I moved to Japan, I called Adobe and I asked them whether I can buy, still living in Germany, a Japanese InDesign version so that I can prepare myself for teaching. And they denied. And then I asked another question. So my father is living in Japan. Can he buy me an InDesign version, paying with his Japanese credit card and give me the license? And they said no. So it was really, really bad. So the only chance I had was like moving to Japan and then getting InDesign by myself on the laptop I got from the university. So, and it was really like, I don't understand until now why this was such a big matter, because I was willing to pay, but they were not willing to give me the license for the Japanese InDesign. And yeah, and so for example, as Tânia just said, like for Japanese version, you can do vertical typesetting with Japanese type. And at that point, with the English version of InDesign, I couldn't do that. So I couldn't try things out that I wanted to prepare for my class. And this inflexibility, like it's a very international, big or mega company, but then having this extreme restrictions, operating very local and not global. So this was very frustrating, I think. And I think as we are working more and more in international environments, I think somehow the software also need to support this and understand this. So yeah, I know this frustration like from another perspective, but
I just wonder how people
You're-
that have to set like multi-script books or whatever do it, because it's really like a complete nightmare, I think.
I think that you're just lazy though. If the French InDesign doesn't set vertical text, just take the font and rotate it 90 degrees and then install it with a different name and then compose your type sideways, but going down the page. What's the matter with you guys? Didn't Eric make a source sans rotated?
It is not source censor, but I have another story from my a friend of my type designer who designs Mongolian. And Mongolian is written in vertical, but change lines from left to right, which is opposite to the CJK layout. So even he designing the typefaces, he cannot make the layout in CJK version of InDesign. So what he does is he make another version in the mirror by mirror reflected, so that he can change first the layout in the vertical layout and change lines from right to left as the Japanese, then get the mirror again to reflect back to Mongolian pages. That is what he is doing. Oh,
wow! But I think like aren't we in the 21st century?
Yeah.
Or are we still like 19 something? So,
Oh, yeah.
sometimes I wonder.
There's still this thing. There's one of the first things I learned about CJK from a guy who is a legend to me, Jerry Lee, who lived in Hong Kong, and he was one of the earliest Macintosh users, and he founded a company called Font Lab Hong Kong, or FontWorks Hong Kong, that was eventually bought by Facade. But in our very first conversation, he said, "Oh no, you don't understand something about us. We have to make fonts dependent on the input method that is going to be used. And there are a wide number of input methods. And what was described by me is one that counts on the font being rotated, and the other one is the font being flipped. And these are just extreme methods for inputting that work because of something that is outside of the realm of the fonts that has intruded into the fonts and said, now you have to do it this way. So I think that's a really good thing, because input is what the regular users are used to. And there were whole markets of people who knew how to input by radical or stroke or whatever it was before that. Now we can have multiple input methods with the same data, right? And that's the ideal. And people are making fonts now that are in CJK that are not whole glyphs with the overlaps removed. They are parts that are variable parts, and it's getting more and more sophisticated. And all these input methods should then work. I don't know about the Mongolian flip one or the rotated ones that I had, but when I was in the early days of making Latin for Japanese, there was rotated Latin was included in the fonts for one of these purposes that I never used any Japanese or Chinese typesetters, so I never really knew about what it was for. But those input methods that are dependent on the fonts are something that has developed into a vocabulary of its own and processes of their own, and in fact jobs for people who know how to do that thing, do that kind of entry. So I think that that's important to consider in our vocabulary thinking about, is the input methods that people are using, so that you can relate to the way the fonts are made to their input method. And for people who are inputting in more complex ways, they understand more about the division of the glyphs than the people who are just doing letter by letter. And in a lot of English applications now, you get past the first letter and you just space and you get the rest of the word. So that's something I look forward to, that sort of expert system development for other scripts where people can get help with their input. And one thing I'd also like to ask this group is whether they have voice recognition for these scripts working, because I'm also very, very concerned about that kind of expert system and artificial intelligence systems that are going to be rolled out for probably the big 7 languages, whatever people think those are. I just heard that term and I've sort of glommed onto it. I don't know what they are, but I'm sure that Latin and Chinese are 2 of them. And then the other question is, how are we going to help with our work to encourage people to add more languages to those things and add more input methods by documenting them, so that people know that there was usefulness for those things at some point, and that it hasn't gone away. That, you know, not all people can input verbally, and not all people can input from the completed character, and sometimes you have to type multiple glyphs, which is how I use those 2 terms differently. A glyph is something, is the unit of a font, and a character is an input. And so and I have to talk that way all the time, because that's what my technology partners at Google and Apple and Microsoft all use those terms that way. And so I know to use them that way. And I know to say characters always with people. No, I mean, normal, non-technical people. But when we start to get into different splits of glyphs and characters, it becomes apparent to people, as I said before, that there's an ascender and a descender. People are inputting by parts. It's something that they understand because they are familiar with the way it was written and the order that it was written, which is not necessarily important in all scripts as it is in some of the Far Eastern languages, because otherwise you couldn't learn them very easily if they were not ordered. So, I mean, I've heard people talk about this in Latin. People talk about Latin and they're totally anti any order of drawing, which I'm not quite sure I understand, because there are Latin styles that depend on order of drawing, and there are some that don't. But then there are other scripts where it's very much dependent on the order that you draw. And so I think that that's something that we have to start talking about and thinking about, because there's different connections between writing and type depending on what culture you're in. And in the American English culture, there's very little writing going on anymore. People sign checks. They sign things online. They don't write. They check boxes. They type. And so there are lots of people who are interested in introducing writing back into, if not calligraphy as well, back into American curriculum, where it's still very, very big. Writing is still taught in a lot of schools for other scripts, because that's how you learn the language, basically. Not that you don't learn that from Latin, but it's just that it's so much easier to type for people. That's convenience has trumped writing.
One thing that I always think about it's not so much a challenge, but I always kind of have this dream as far as like future vocabulary issues goes, that there are so many related terms for describing the styles of letter forms that are different depending on the different media or technique. So graffiti has a whole own system of ways of describing certain kinds of letters and ornamenting letters, and the same is true for calligraphy, for sign painting, for stone carving, but there is a lot of kind of crossover. Like if you say what's a serif to people working in all those techniques, they'll understand it. But then there's, I think, other more interesting terms that are maybe specialized to those techniques that I feel like if there was more crossover, there might also encourage more kind of stylistic crossovers where ideas for different shapes of letters and glyphs could kind of jump over to the other side of the tracks, so to speak. And it's always been kind of interesting to me because so many people are kind of working in related fields, but they're almost in like little silos where they have their own specialized sets of terms. So it's nice to like get some kind of a documentation so that people from across all those fields can kind of look through and understand how maybe other people are thinking about letters, or even within the field of type design, like having English terminology and description for non-Latin typographic techniques can definitely inform how people approach Latin typography.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm also thinking about so many things at the same time.
There was
Oh,
there was a nice question from Rosalie on the chat
Yeah,
that mostly for Lisa, but that it's also kind of fitting into what Dick was also mentioning. So
Yeah, I was about to go on with that one. Well, now for the Q&A session. Rosalie is asking, I think it was in relation with one of the former topics earlier. How do you sort out on Words of Type website when the same word means something different in languages? For example, character, which can be translated to caractère in French. Character refers to the encoded sign, and in French, it can refer in addition to the typeface itself. Do you have text for all meanings and translate it, or do you have specific content per language? Yes, each language is treated as an independent thing, even though each translations are related with one another. But how it has been worked was that whenever someone would go and check for the description of a word in one language, I made sure that this word is being well understood and explained in the context of that language in particular. And the text all the descriptions are not like exactly translated from one language to another. Otherwise, I would have used Google Translate instead of real people. But yeah, there are words, for example, in Chinese, there are words that are specific to Chinese type design that are fairly understood easily from anyone who understands Chinese. But then in the context of a French person looking at that word's description, you need to explain a bit more about how Chinese works, blah, 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 in the way to really understand what that means. So yeah, but that was yeah. It's a really complex thing, and all the translations have taken longer than I thought. Even between French and English, like I'm not fluent in English, but I had to switch from one and the other so many times in order to like trying to think, okay, character in French. We used to say character when we mean typeface, for example. And to avoid confusion, each time there's this clarification, like between police de caractère and caractère, the glyph sort of. There are. I try to each time make this clarification as clear as possible without sounding too rigid, like this is this point, period, and nothing else. Yeah. I don't know if you, everyone else here have something to say about it, or because so far it's the only question in the chat window.
I just want to say thank you for all of this. I'm T and I'm Vietnamese. Like I'm very lucky to use that our language using Latin alphabet. So it's quite a bit like more rare better that we have that chance to share the same thing with English. But because of all of the typography is quite very new in Vietnam, and a lot of term that back then that like people who like spend time with typography in Vietnam way back in the past, and some of them documented, but somehow that all of the document that we found is quite not in Vietnam anymore. It's kind of like go around the world. Like sometimes we find it in France, sometimes we find it in the US. So when we know the term, for example, like how you say character, like when we use that and then search for character in like French library, it's very helpful. And then from that, we can actually find the document that already like disappear in Vietnam for about typography. So yeah, I just want to say that it's quite helpful to know different language and different typography term in different language.
Thanks, T. Was that a question? Like, I'm not sure.
No, that's
there
a question.
or-
I just want to say thank you for this discussion because it's like back of my head, and then with my team and other people, we've been thinking about this all the time. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, Rosalie has another question. She says, I would also find interesting to implement Nick's vulgarization of words. Weight for dummies would be thickness.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, weight, I feel like in that case, it's maybe less about dumbing down the concept of weight and more just trying to steer away from the use of weight to mean something that's not weight, like italicization or something like that.
Well,
But
in French, we call it graisse, which could be translated as fat.
right, there's I have been involved with the Hamilton Wood Type Museum in Tours, Wisconsin, and in my time there, I got to meet this guy named Nord Brilski, who was a woodworker who worked in the factory making wood type way back when. And he always referred to weight. And this is a good example, actually, of how different people from kind of different fields use different terms. He always referred to the weight of a typeface as its heft. And I always really like that because it heft, H-E-F-T, which is like, I don't know, it's heaviness. In my mind, it has this kind of
really
industrial feeling, like it's a like a hefty bag of like Santa Claus's bag. I don't know why that's what I think of, but it just seems like a very like Midwest American way of describing typographic weight, and I always kind of like that term. But yeah, I think weight, most people, even kind of lay people who aren't as familiar with graphic design, if you said like the weight of a typeface, I think most people kind of understand that it's bold or regular. But yeah, these are the kind of like exercises I go through when I see terms that that seem more complicated than they need to be, and I try to think of like alternatives that, like the other one that always really annoyed me was like for the dot over an I, people call it a tittle for some reason, which I guess is like it sounds British to me, like a British way of saying like, oh, a little tittle of cookies or something. And I was like, why just call it a dot? People know what dots are. Like, why be cutesy with it? It just seems like unnecessarily complex. Yeah, and I have like a list of so many things like that I'm always trying to like push out into the world, just like in my everyday, posting on Mastodon or whatever, and trying to make things easier to understand.
So if you don't like tittle, I guess you don't like jot either.
I don't even know what that is.
Well, I mean, there's a saying in English that when you make sure that your document is right, you've dotted the I's and crossed the T's.
Oh, right.
And that has come from jots and tittles. Tittles are dots and jots are the crosses of the T's. So
is that a British thing?
I'm not British, so I'm not going to testify vocabulary on this. But I've heard both of those terms both of those terms I've heard all my life. And I never considered them to be typographic terms, and I still don't.
Yeah.
So I don't use jot or tittle because nobody really understands them, and the translations are dot and dash.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
I mean, everybody understands those.
There is one term that I've always found interesting as far as both just like if you're trying to record what it means, but it also relates to a question you had earlier about terms that mean different things. And there's this idea of ink traps, which I think today most type designers understand an ink trap to be kind of like a void of blackness in the corner of the typeface. But if you go back and look at like writing about typography from the 40s and 50s, it meant actually the exact opposite thing. It was like the ink trap was parts of the letters that trapped ink and got filled in. And people started kind of designing the typefaces to counteract that. And I'm not sure like when that changed from meaning the place where ink gets stuck to meaning a device to avoid ink getting too stuck. But that was something that I remember reading it for the first time. It was in like an old inland printer or something like that. And I was like, wait, what are they? I was really confused because it literally means almost the exact opposite of what most people understand it as today.
I'm not sure about that because the ink trap is like it's an additional place for the ink to go. It's like a mouse trap.
Yeah.
Mouse trap is a place where the mouse can go to get caught. And the ink trap is a place where what happened though is that there were things that are the opposite of ink traps, which are ink extensions.
Globs.
Photo typography. So
you're talking about the spikes.
Yeah, it's things that get rounded off. So you have a trap and a WoT, a trap and bait. I'm not sure.
I talked to Frank Romano once about this.
Yeah.
Because I was curious what people called them. I had heard people call them light traps, which is kind of like the opposite. And that was kind of what they did also. But he said people just called them spikes when they were.
At Linotype, everyone called them crow's feet.
Crow's feet.
These are the lines that form as your eyes age, and you start to get wrinkles on the edges of your eyes that go out from your eyes. And that Sherry Cohn, Matthew Carter, everybody at the Linotype office called them crow's feet,
Interesting.
which has nothing to do with the crow or
What about the guillemot?
they have feet that go like this.
The other thing, I have like a whole list of just things that I was kind of writing as I was reading through your questions. And the other one is like the classic, well, actually thing that you see people online being like, well, actually, and I think it's, again, like Tânia said earlier, it's all about context, and that's between font and typeface. In many, I would say most situations, the differentiation isn't a huge issue, but there are situations where the differentiation can be quite significant. For example, at least in the United States, you can copyright a font, but you can't copyright a typeface. You can maybe get a limited patent on the typeface, but you can't copyright it. And that's like a very clear situation where those things, especially if you're trying to be like very accurate in the wording of legal brief or something, that there's quite a good reason to make a very clear distinction between those things. Yeah, I think a lot of times people kind of weaponize knowing about that and use it as a way to like say, well, actually, and sometimes that's just like.
Actually, I was thinking that the going back to the like dumbing down of expressions like the lowercase numerals that Nick mentioned before. I think this would be great. Like you say, like you don't like to invent words, but things only get implemented if it gets used. So maybe Lisa can take some suggestions from Nick and start adding it to words of type as also known as lowercase numerals.
And I might add something that we haven't discussed yet, but we don't even have the same names or the same words for the characters. I mean, when I try to spell I and E in particular, in my language, they don't come out in other languages the same. I think you all know this, right? I is E and E is A, and O is yes, and yes is no.
Yeah, that was so confusing when I had to learn English.
So it'd be great to have a sort of a chart of starting with the letters and then going on to weights and widths and whatever else we have. We don't have names for everything in every language, but we do have lots of names for lots of things in lots of languages, and starting to have sort of this two-dimensional database of words and languages, I think would be a really good thing to add to what we're trying to make.
Yeah, that's why a website works as a good format, so that there can be always new improvements, new, I don't know, fixes made into it. So yeah. There's a question from Garin, I guess. I don't read Armenian, but I suppose it's you.
It's me.
Hello. Yeah. You were asking, I'm curious if Words of Type will also delve into translating the word classification, as it carries a unique story for each script. How deep will Words of Type go? Yeah, well, classification is definitely one of the words that are in the first edition of Words of Type. It's also one of the longest words like to be described. I think it has about 500 words in the description of classification in itself, because there are so many things to talk about. That's, I think it's gonna be one version, and there will be more updates added into it, because so far I've only described what classification means for the languages that are into words of type so far, and when at someday, I hope soon, there will be, for example, Arabic added into words of type. There will be also like I'll have to add what classification is for Arabic typefaces. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation too.
Yeah, well, I want to thank everyone here as well to be around, and all the guests here to join me into this conversation. We are over time now. I've said that it's gonna end at 3:30 p.m. So, but we are a bit over time. But yeah, it's I hope to make it more like as a regular thing. The next episode will be in 3 months, in early December, and it's gonna be about learning and teaching. Two also really interesting topic. I can say already that all the guests are confirmed. There will be Jean-Baptiste Levé from Projection Type, Indra Kupferschmidt. You all know her. If you don't know her, I don't know, like if you don't have internet. There's going to be also Cara Di Eduardo from Type at Cooper, Jen Ramirez, also teaching at Type at Cooper, and Li Zhiqian, a type designer from China, from 3Type Foundry. So yeah, I'm hoping that it's gonna be just as interesting as today's conversation. And I've also have a list of all the next conversations episodes on the line. Like the third episode will be right on the same day as International Women's Day. So I guess that you already know the topic. I couldn't avoid like not having that episode about women in type design industry or typography industry. So yeah, that's so far.
Is it about words for women in the type industry?
No, women. I don't know if there could be specific words for. Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. I have never thought about it. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that there have been more than 15 people on YouTube Live following us so far. So yeah. Yeah.
Who else is hungry?
Who else is hungry? I'm always hungry.
It's been wonderful talking to you all, and I want to thank you. But I'm about to eat my keyboard, and it's not made out of cake.
Yeah, well, thank you all. Thank you so much for being here, and hope to see you on the next one.
Yeah, thanks for organizing.
Yeah, have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.